Nature is in freefall. According to the UN, up to 150 species are going extinct every day, and that was only an estimate made in 2007. And whilst scientists scramble across the globe to try and save nature, we just keep losing species, ecosystems, and habitats. So is it time we take a new approach to conservation and rewilding? A revolutionary anarchist approach? We're all aware that nature is in a pretty bad place. Across the world, species numbers are plummeting, and some are even saying that we are in a 6th mass extinction event. To put that into context, the last 5th mass extinction event was the asteroid that wiped out the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. Yikes, are we about to become dinosaurs 2.0? No, but seriously, with 150 species going extinct every day, you can imagine why we are in quite a bad place ecologically. And species and ecosystems disappearing off the face of the earth will have knock-on impacts on our food systems, our soils, our freshwater systems, and even the fine balance of gases that are in the air that enable us to breathe. It's a given that our global ecological crisis isn't the fault of most humans. A lot of ecosystems are already being taken care of by indigenous peoples, though apparently the well-referenced figure of 80% has actually recently been debunked. So don't trust everything you read online or even in published scientific journals, kids. But it's the ever-churning profit god called capitalism, which emerged out of feudalist Europe, that is the main driving force behind our ecological crisis. After all, the ever-present goal of make more profit means trawling the seas of more and more fish, cutting down the forests to produce more animal feed, pillaging more rare metals from the earth, and poisoning the air by burning and consuming more and more fossil fuels. And even regulating capitalism into some form of green growth won't help curb the speed at which we are progressing towards ecological collapse, as I mentioned in my latest video, link above here somewhere. In the UK, the ecological crisis is especially apparent. Species have declined by 19% since the 1970s, and 1/6 of all of our species are at risk of extinction. This goes up to 1/4 for all of our native mammals, and meanwhile more than half of our flowering plants, mosses and liverworts have decreased in areas where they used to thrive. And let's not even talk about all the species which have previously gone extinct from the British Isles. Wolves, bison, lynx, white-tailed seagulls, brown bears, storks, ospreys, beavers, European tree frogs, wild boar, northern pool frogs, grey auks, large copper butterflies, Ivor's sea anemone, the apple bumblebee. Yeah, the list is really f***ing long, and that's not even all of them. Some of these species, like the grey auk and Ivor's sea anemone, are now considered completely extinct. Others, like the wild boar, beaver, northern pool frog, stork, white-tailed sea eagle and osprey, are in various processes of re-establishment in the UK through both planned reintroductions and guerrilla rewilding. And of course then there's the even longer list of wildlife which have gone extinct from many parts of the UK and now only cling on to very few areas within the UK, such as pine martens, red squirrels, or even the willow tit. Now I'm focusing on the UK specifically in this video, not just because I live here, but also because I think we're a very interesting case when it comes to rewilding. According to a study done by the Natural History Museum in 2021, we're in the bottom 10% of countries in the whole world in terms of the biodiversity we have left, with only 53% of our native wildlife still intact. We are literally at rock bottom. As an island, it's been especially easy for us to kill off our native species and for them never to be able to make it back naturally. Apart from the few migrant bird species which might make it back here naturally, it is all now down to us to restore and reintroduce the species we have lost. We have so many opportunities to restore the species and wildlife here that it should be a really exciting time. We should be in a place where we can go from nature crisis to eco-haven in as short a time frame as we decide upon ourselves. And yet that's just not how it's going. Conservation in the UK, as in many other parts of the world, is controlled by the push and pull of various stakeholders. Be that profiteering companies, manipulated farming lobbies, slow academia, or the capitalist state, leaving the average person who is interested in nature completely powerless. But traditional methods of conservation are infallible and must be adhered to at all costs, right? So So I've seen both sides of the coin when it comes to conservation and rewilding in the UK. As a student who did a bachelor's and master's in conservation, I did a lot of reading on successful conservation projects in both the UK and across the world. And there have been some very successful, by-the-books, long-term projects that have seen species bounce back from the brink. Red kite reintroductions, for example, was a project of massive success that was done with all the prim and proper conservation standards. Lots of research was done beforehand, governmental permissions were secured, stakeholder opinions were taken into account, the animals were quarantined, yada yada yada. And the result was fantastic. By the 1980s, red kites were barely clinging on to the UK with just a few remaining breeding pairs, whilst in 2020, these pairs had turned from just a few to 1,800. That's 7% of the whole world's population of red kites. And that was all thanks to the reintroductions that had been done. Yet despite the successful projects such as the red kite reintroductions, I've always felt that things just weren't being done fast enough in comparison to the scale of the ecological crisis we are in. For example, part of the reason why our biodiversity in the UK is in freefall is due to the overgrazing of deer, because we don't have any large predators left here in this country. The lynx reintroductions, which could help alleviate this issue, were first proposed officially in 2008, but had been in conversation for a lot longer than that. We've had social, ecological and economic surveys done, proposals to the government, multiple year-long studies at the most favourable locations, research with every stakeholder possible, and a whole organisation formed just to try and make it happen. And yet still, in 2024, we're no closer to this actually going anywhere. Even with all the research pointing to a lynx reintroduction being favourable for pretty much everyone involved. And the same is true for a lot of species. With beavers, for example, there's only one officially recognised wild population in England on the River Otter, and the rest are all under lock and key in enclosures, even though we already know the benefits beavers bring in terms of both biodiversity and mitigating for climate impacts. And the wild beavers we do have on the River Otter, well, they actually got there unofficially and then were graciously allowed to stay. To quote the Devon Wildlife Trust, they are of unknown origin. Now, I'll come back to these beavers of unknown origin in a bit. Though, a side note here, those of us who are in the conservation world in the UK probably do have a tiny little inkling of who did put them there. It's hardly an expertly guarded secret. But anyway, the purpose of my channel isn't to spread the conservation tea all over the internet. Though maybe it should be, that would probably actually be quite a fun channel to run. All in all though, as a student studying conservation, I already had this sense that things were taking too damn long. Through a series of fortunate events, I ended up becoming the director of a conservation group that reintroduced the first waterfoals back to southern Cornwall, since their local extinction which had happened in the 1990s. At the time, I really felt like we were doing what other organisations had failed to do. After all, waterfoals are an especially easy species to bring back. They're one of a few species that you don't need a legal licence to reintroduce because they never fully disappeared from the UK, so it's still classified as a native species. They're endangered in the UK, so should be a priority species for introductions. They're relatively cheap and easy to get a hold of, and many reintroductions have been done with them previously, which means there's a lot of research out there telling you exactly how you need to do it and what kind of habitat they best need, and etc. And really the main kind of monitoring you need to do before and during and after the release is to make sure you find and trap and kill any American mink which pose a great threat to them. And yet despite all of this, we were the first group to introduce them to anywhere in Cornwall except the very north since the 1990s. That seemed crazy to me. Like, why hadn't the large charities or larger nature organisations already done this? Although I'm no longer part of that group, I still feel the same. In my opinion, nature conservation and rewilding in this country is far too slow compared to the state of the ecological crisis we are in. That being said though, there is a lot of nuance to this issue. After all, things being done slowly isn't any one person's fault. With every chance to help nature in this country, there are a million different stakeholders trying to have their say in the matter. The farming lobbies, the profiteering companies, the state whose main motive is to keep the economy growing. Even the nature conservation organisations trying to bring back some of these species have so much infighting. Because, for example, bringing back a predator species might mean that a ground nesting bird species decreases in number, and so forth. Under our capitalist system, where making an exponential profit is often the only measure of success, it's no wonder that nature is deprioritised and anything conservation related takes so long. On a side note here though, even reintroduction proposals like the lynx have spent so much time and resources researching how a lynx reintroduction would actually benefit the economy, just to prove to our current capitalist state that restoring nature will actually be beneficial to them. And yet still nothing's happened. I actually hate the system so much. Anyway, even though personally me think nothing's happening fast enough. I still sometimes have doubts about my own opinions. Like, maybe the system is right? Maybe we do need to take a million years to make any bold step in conservation. After all, there are plenty of times that conservation and rewilding projects have failed, and maybe because they didn't do enough research beforehand. Many call the Dutch nature reserve Oostvaardersplassen, sorry if I mispronounced that terribly, a rewilding project gone wrong, for example, as a bunch of herbivores were chucked into an enclosure and left to their own devices with no large natural predators present. Of course, this led to them breeding so much that when the winter came, they eventually ran out of food and starved, leading to animal rights activists having to chuck hay over the fence to try and save some of them. There are also a lot of reintroductions that have gone less well than planned, though these failures are also less reported than they should be. The reintroduction of the brown tree creeper in Australia, for example, resulted in lots of birds dying due to stresses from translocation, lack of habitat familiarity, and insufficient effectiveness of restoration treatments. In addition to the animals themselves potentially dying, reintroductions also pose risks in terms of spreading diseases, and if the wrong species is reintroduced in the wrong place, this could also have negative cascading effects on the ecosystem. So the question is, should rewilding and conservation activities be left to the experts who have the state's permission to undertake them? Should we, the average citizen, who have not much control over which species are reintroduced or which ecosystems are restored, just wait around and hope that one day a reintroduction might be okayed by the government and actually happen? Or should we take things into our own hands? After all, we are all a part of nature. Our continued existence on this planet depends on us halting and reversing the ecological crisis, which depends on us bringing back biodiversity as quickly as physically possible. In the case of such a crisis, should we really let the potential failures of reintroduction projects hold us back? Or should we take things into our own hands and start restoring nature without lawful permission? Well, some people have, and they're called guerrilla rewilders. Now, there are two main guerrilla practices that particularly apply to the UK, but I'm going to focus on guerrilla reintroductions in this video. The other anarchist method of rewilding is guerrilla gardening, and involves growing plants in public spaces in a grassroots fashion, even if you don't technically have permission to. Guerrilla reintroductions, or beaver bombing as they're colloquially called, are very similar to guerrilla gardening. They involve releasing native species, such as beavers, back into the wild to help bring back biodiversity and restore ecosystems. Now, this is where things start to get exciting. To be honest, researching all about guerrilla rewilding kind of makes me feel like I'm dipping my toes into something I shouldn't be. Do you remember those beavers I talked about earlier in the video? The ones who mysteriously appeared on the River Otter and were from unknown origin? Well, they're not the only beavers that have mysteriously appeared on rivers up and down the English countryside. In fact, this Guardian article claims that beavers are now living freely on river systems across swathes of southern England. And despite no official releases, beavers have turned up on river systems across Devon and spread through Somerset to Wiltshire and Gloucestershire. An established population has been living freely and largely unnoticed in lowland Kent for years, and now numbers 51 territories, more than 200 animals. And it's not just beavers that are being reintroduced up and down the prim and proper British countryside. Rogue butterfly bombing has been going on for decades and is incredibly hard to trace. And then there are other species like wild boar, which were hunted to extinction and then brought back into the UK to be bred for meat, where populations escaped into the wild, and then they are now slowly spreading back across the UK. Officially, however, they're still not recognised as a native species and formal reintroductions are banned. And then there's cases like the New Forest pine martens, where pine martens mysteriously reappeared in the New Forest one day, which is right at the south of England, despite the fact that the only other known populations of pine martens were very far away in parts of Wales and northern England. Articles about the pine martens' reappearance don't give any indication as to how on earth they could have gotten so far. None of the wildlife organisations involved in surveying this mysterious new population say anything else either, instead only saying that the pine martens have established a population. By themselves? Like, can they f***ing fly? Anyway, I think it's quite funny that the government and these large official wildlife charities and bodies choose to turn a blind eye to guerrilla rewilders. Some, however, aren't so happy about what the guerrilla rewilders have been up to. There's an article from The Guardian in 2020 that talks about a man called Martin White, who's been a butterfly bomber all his life. The article says that White and his peers have quietly released captive bred wild animals that were once commonplace in Britain, beavers, turtle doves, butterflies, even glowworms. To the conservation establishment, these men are not allies but pests, who do more harm than good. Professional conservationists complain that unsanctioned reintroductions mess up their data. If conservation scientists can't accurately measure whether a wild population is increasing or falling, they can't understand what's causing a decline or take steps to stop it. The article also points out that guerrilla reintroductions can antagonize local communities and local farmers, making it more likely that the released wildlife will be killed. Later on in the article, White says, "I'm just seen as an interloper, an attention seeker. They called me a schoolboy introductionist until recently, anything to undermine what I'm doing." Similarly, a more recent article from 2023 interviews a man under the alias of Simon, who has moved beavers up and down the country, likely aiding their recent spread to a growing number of rivers from Devon to Wiltshire and Kent. He also releases pine martens and is currently preparing to set free a brood of white storks. The article then goes on to say, "For many ecologists, unlicensed releases raise plenty of red flags. The biggest is introducing diseases," says Katie Beckman. While mostly a concern in cross-border translocations, she says this can also occur when captive animals are released into the wild after coming into contact with exotic species. "You're not just moving the animal, but you're moving its whole complement of parasites and viruses and bacteria with it," Beckman says. Lastly, the article interviews a member of the Specialist Unit for Conservation Translocations at the IUCN, the internationalist conservation body that is somewhat of an authority on all things species reintroductions. This interviewee says, "The status quo is that we're monitoring things into extinction. There's also a risk in inaction, and that's becoming clearer to a lot of people." So, all this leaves the question: should rewilding be more anarchist? Should we encourage conservationists to go out there and conduct guerrilla reintroductions? On the one hand, scientists say that unregulated reintroductions can end up killing the animals that they are planning to reintroduce, spread diseases, corrupt data, and make farmers and other communities even more antagonistic to the idea of rewilding. But on the other hand, we are in a catastrophic ecological crisis and a sixth mass extinction event. Our government is only focusing on growing the economy, whilst reintroductions are further being stalled by conservationist infighting and the academic need for monitoring every single piece of data. All the while, the average nature lover is mostly powerless to undertake any real action to restore ecosystems or species under the current law in this country. Personally, I do believe things need to happen faster, though obviously I am not condoning any illegal activities. But something a lot of us do forget is that we all do have power at the end of the day to create a more utopian world, and that includes bringing back biodiversity. Obviously, all reintroduction projects should do their best to ensure genetic diversity, eliminate the spread of diseases, and make sure the project is a success. But I also don't think we should be so scared of failure. After all, if we don't act, we'll be facing a future a lot worse than a few animals dying from failed reintroductions. We'll be facing a future that involves the collapse of the ecosystems around us, meaning our inability to grow food and millions of species plummeting into extinction. On a more positive note, I am hoping that one day maybe we will see lynx and wolves back in the UK in whichever way they decide to get here. So what do you think of guerrilla reintroductions? Have you heard any rumours of unlicensed wildlife releases happening in your area? Let me know in the comments down below. See you in the next one. Bye!